What to do, what to do. So before I get into an analogy, if Israel were the land of Israel were a woman, pertaining to my last video, I just wanted to reiterate something from my last video as well, that the reason, which I wish someone would have told me long ago, and that is that the reason why there's sacrifice and circumcision in the Old Testament before the law of Moses is not a deep metaphor. It's simply a history that has been somewhat lost through time. And I want to start this metaphor pretty soon, but first let me just say, if anybody is watching, to let me know if this is choppy. If this is coming in choppy, I don't want to continue. I want to turn this off. It's snowing, and that might be making this come in not too clear. So I'd like to stop if it's coming in real choppy. So please alert me if it is. Now, this metaphor, if Israel was a woman, think about this. If there was a woman in Spain, and it was 800 years ago or something, and she had a husband who was a Christian, and the Christian husband went on the Crusades. He went to the Middle East to free up the Holy Land from the Muslims. And imagine that when he did that, there was a Muslim living in Spain, because there were Muslims living in Spain then, and in his absence, while he was stepping out, while the other guy was stepping out, he was stepping in. And so at first, maybe it was an assault, but her not having anybody around, and she already had succumbed, and he's giving her provisions, and her husband is not, she might find it easier to simply succumb again, to allow him to give her gifts, and have an understanding that he's to be gone when the husband comes back. So every time the husband's stepping out, this other guy's stepping in. And let's say there was a mistake where nobody was there. They were both on some mission, and she was all alone. And then there's a third guy, and he steps in. Now, this is, think about the language of Hebrew. It's not so much that they took a little bit of Eastern language, Northern language, and infused it with Southern or Western language. It's more so that they took knowledge of the one and knowledge of the other, so they have knowledge of both. It's not necessarily that they don't know either, that they come up with some independent language unrelated to the other ones. And so in my prior video, I had said that, the word Elohim comes from the plural pronoun Ella, which means these. So Elohim could mean all of the aforementioned gods. All of the aforementioned gods, all the ones that are already known. And if you think about that metaphor I just expounded, or just laid out, that think about that in terms of the land of Israel, that if they had these more powerful nations, if they were a weaker nation, and there were these more powerful nations surrounding them, they would not have the choice to, for thousands of years, simply deny all the other gods and everything. That if you are passed around like a plate, that everyone's taking a bite from the dish, then you don't have the luxury of denying everyone else's God. And it's not a matter of judgment of the people. It's simply reasonable. People don't always have some diehard conviction that they're going to sacrifice their lives over. They wouldn't even, go through the desert to find their own paradise, and it's just human nature. And so when we have Abraham being talked to by Yahweh, nobody believes that was a theophany, that he saw the face. And in Genesis 15, it explicitly says that it was the Dabar, the word, that came to him. So the word, aka Jesus, has always been a separate part. So there are these different persons throughout the Old Testament. There is God's Spirit, there is God's Word, and if I may, there is also God's Moloch. There is God's angel or messenger. And this, when they came into the Yahwehistic tradition, there came the saying from Deuteronomy that the Lord is echad. The Lord is one. And so that doesn't mean that the Lord is a singular person. That means that the Lord is united as like a Trinity. And the understanding may have been that all these other gods, whether they acknowledged what the other nations said these gods were, nobody can know. Whether they gave it lip service or otherwise, nobody knows. But it seemed to be that the name of the god originally for the land where you're right in the middle of the world, naturally becoming more sophisticated geographically. And that's not saying anything to do with people today, because the people today came from an extremity of the world, the far north, the ones that claim it today, or the far south even, but it wasn't exactly in the middle of the world. So the middle of the world back then, 2,000 years ago, might have been where one would look to get a more sophisticated knowledge. But that changed over time. And I used to claim it. There was about 6 months where I was a Muslim and I was saying I was one of them, that I was saying I was Israelite. And why was I saying it? It was because I felt like I was. Because the people that do claim it, I seem to match. I knew the Old Testament. I was circumcised. I was part Mediterranean. I was, believing in the same God and everything. And I was just like, okay, what is it about these people and their claim that is not true for me? And I couldn't figure it out. So I felt my claim was just as valid as theirs. But I don't think that anymore. And the reason is because I don't believe in the law. I don't believe anybody's under the law, and to be one of those people, you have to be under the law. And I do not believe there's such thing as a messianic. I believe a messianic is a Christian. Peter didn't say, I'm a messianic. No, Peter said, I'm a Christian. Paul said, I'm a Christian. So I don't believe there's such thing as a messianic. I believe the body is made up of both. And the body of Christ is what is Christian. So now if I may read Colossians 1:24, it says, I now rejoice in my sufferings for you. So he's suffering here for the Colossians. The Colossians were mostly Gentiles who had, I can't say that they're mostly Gentiles, but that they had, because of Christ, been not under the law, but there were people who were creeping in, just like the Galatians and the Corinthians and everything else. This is the same problem that was talked about in Acts. There were people that were creeping in that were trying to put them back under the law, or under the law for the first time. It doesn't make much of a difference, because that's what makes one of this faith of Judaism is the law of Moses, not a bloodline. When they say circumcision of the flesh, that means something that happened on the eighth day, more or less, that this was a practice, that they circumcise the flesh. It doesn't mean that their bloodline is Israel. And when Jesus said this faithless and wicked generation, he meant just that. He didn't mean a race of people. He didn't mean this generation won't pass away, as this race won't pass away until the last day. No, not at all. He meant this generation, because a generation was 40 years. And so at year 30, he was saying that, they might be old by year 70, but they won't all pass away before that day. Even in Matthew 23, that was my biggest holdout. I was like, well, when he called them brood of vipers, that seems like that could be a race or generation, but I'm past all that. I don't believe that anymore. That sounds racist. That this viper generation, it was a viper generation. It was one point in time, and they might have said this blood beyond us and our children, but that doesn't mean that was God's will, nor does that mean it was bad. Blood on our children may mean salvation. Remember, their robes were whitened by the blood of the Lamb, if they accept it. And so what did Paul mean here in Colossians 1:24? How can he fill up in my flesh what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ? Wasn't Christ's afflictions the salvation of the whole world? So great in suffering that it could conquer all sin? What's up with that? How could Paul, is Paul being sacrilegious? No, not at all. Because you got to understand, when Jesus died, let's go to John 19. He told Pontius Pilate, what did he tell him? That their sin is greater. Their sin is greater. Or was it John 18? Oh yes, John 19:11. You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. And this verse might have come from Romans 13. Not come from, but that the knowledge of Romans 13, John used from his knowledge of what happened at the crucifixion, and use the same language, or Paul knew the language from the crucifixion through Peter or something, and use it in Romans 13 or whatever. But nonetheless, it says, therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Well, you go back to John 18, it was the high priest group. The high priest group had the greater sin. And all the people were under the law. It says right here, verse 7 of 19, the blanks answered him, we have a law, and under our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. So this was not something the Romans had against him. Pilate washed his hands. So remember, Paul said, it says in the law of Moses, that he become accursed. This was the law of Moses. And Jesus said, do not go into any of the villages of the Samaritans, but only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So I'm not trying to be Israel only. I'm trying to articulate something that happened. That even if Jesus knew of the salvation of the world wasn't ready yet. Even if he died for the world, that was not clear yet. The Great Commission didn't come until after Jesus died. And as he was dying, talking about the Romans, he said, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So how are they guilty of his death when they knew not what they did? And Paul said in Romans, the law is for those that are under it. Well, the Gentiles have their own law. They have their own morals. It's wrong to murder in Gentile lands, regardless of what Moses said. No regard for what Moses said, and you still can't murder. And so this brings us into Acts 15. But before I go into Acts 15, that you are invited by me to simply go back again and look at the body of Christ. I believe it was I can't remember where that was. So, but you have, I think it was Colossians or Corinthians, but you have the foot and the head and the eye, and you have all these different parts of the body. Well, that's what Paul is saying about filling up the measure of the sin, because the body wasn't complete yet. It only contained the Israelite portion. And that's how Paul fills up the measure, because Paul was the minister to the Gentiles. And even though Jesus gave the Great Commission, Peter wasn't on it. Peter stayed back in Jerusalem and was afraid to even eat at the nation's houses. And so where was I going? I wanted to go to Acts 15, but before I went to Acts 15, I wanted to go to Romans 11. Romans 11. So in Romans 11, he talked about in times past and all that. So he says right here in 11:13, for I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, but I'll have to get back to you on this, but Paul clearly talks about it in many times over as a mystery. It was a mystery how the nations were to be saved. And I don't believe, which a lot of people will do, that you can take someone back to the Old Testament and prove that there wasn't, a different law for the people, one nation and another nation, that there wasn't a superiority doctrine or anything. And they will try. I've tried. I say, go back, and the other has, well, go to Isaiah 49:6. There you go. So yeah, you can proof text. You can find a cherry-picked verse, but you can't get around the servants and handmaids one when they get their cherry-picked verse. So both is right, and there's no middle ground, and that doesn't work. So, and a lot of them will tell you when you press somebody that's Israel only or election, to believe in election, like a Calvinist, then they will say, look at the Old Testament. Look at the Old Testament. And it's just what it is. Like that's how the Old Testament looked at it. That the only one nation did he know, and the New Testament knew this. So what seemed like an impossible task, like how do you have a Levitical Messiah, a Josephian Messiah, as well as Davidic Messiah, and all these other irreconcilable things? Somehow they pulled it off by articulating exactly what happened that makes sense in the old as best as anybody could. So much so that it had to be the Spirit. But to say that this is so clear in the Old Testament is not true. That the mystery, it became a mystery how the nations, the rest of the body would be included, how that would be pulled off. And it wasn't Peter alone, it was much greater than that. Peter played a part. Go Peter. Peter's the dude. But Peter was a scary dude. He was scared of the high priest group. He was scared. Sorry, my battery ain't tripping. He was scared of the high priest group. He was scared of just about everything. He was afraid to even leave Jerusalem. Because he was like, oh, you're going to come back right now and restore our kingdom? Because he was thinking about the kingdom being fleshly and physical. So he's going to stay put. They knew it was going to be soon. Because Jesus said it was going to be soon. And soon meaning that generation. And that's when it ended. That's when the old system and went out with a bang. And that's what the whole book of Revelation is about. That's why it seems so crazy. That's what Matthew 24 is about. That's why it seemed like it's so wild, because this was a big deal. When you talk about God's order being set aside, you gotta really sell it. It can't just be something somebody said. The whole temple was destroyed. The whole Levitical system was destroyed. This was a big deal. And that's what the book of Hebrews is all about. And so there was a mystery, this body being put together, and Paul put the Gentile portion in. This was Paul's work. Paul was a light to the nations. And you can't understand Acts 15 without understanding Paul and his differing with the other people. Now, James the Just was not one of the apostles in the strictest sense. And you go back to John 7, he didn't even believe. And but we know by the time he wrote the epistle of James, he did. So where does Acts 15 fall? Well, that was before he wrote the epistle and after John 7. So when he believed, just because whether he's in the upper room is going to make or break this argument. Just being close to his mother and the apostles doesn't mean that he knew the truth. Apparently, Paul only knew the truth, and he was only figuring it out. Acts 13 is when he said, okay, I'm going to the Gentiles. So he just decided he's going to the Gentiles, and already James knows everything. After all Paul did to discern, all the studying he did, all of a sudden James knows exactly what Paul knows. And then you assume that Luke knows that James knows that Paul knows. When Luke wasn't even there. So that it's really too far of a stretch to think that the Jerusalem Council, although important in history, has any bearing on us today. Or to believe that that's what Paul thought. Paul will tell you himself in 2 Corinthians 10 and 10. 2 Corinthians 10:10. They say, I am weak in person, but strong in writing. When they would come to him in Acts 21, Acts 15, by Acts 18, he was still doing things under the law. Didn't say for Acts 18 there was getting a lot of pressure, but surely by Acts 21 he was. So even Paul in Acts 15 didn't have it all sussed out. But in Acts 21, it says straight up, of the myriads of people who are zealous for the law. You have tens of thousands of people zealous for the law. That means weak in faith, who are going to be turned from Jesus by watching you forsake the law, dishonor the law, because they were zealous for the law. Not because you are zealous for the law. Not because Paul is zealous for the law, because they are zealous for the law. That's why Paul is to do this. But Paul was weak in person. So Paul is going to cave into James, because James is trying to sell the Noahide doctrine, the 7 laws of Noah, but you're saying, John, no, you're wrong. Actually, he only gave him 4 laws. 4 laws. Well, the 3 laws he didn't give him, of setting up a court, do not murder, etc., were already practiced amongst the Greeks. They already had courts established. They already had a law not to murder, and whatever the other one is. It had to be to not offend the Hebrews, the Ebre. He had to tell the Gentiles, Christians, as a concession, not because it's right, to abstain from things they wouldn't otherwise do, like blood and sexual immorality and all these other, especially Hebrew things or something. And that was to not offend these other people that are still on the milk, still babies, still weak. They needed this boost. So all these other people had to become servants of the law for their sake. They had to be put first because they're babies. Okay? It has nothing to do with being right or wrong. You always think everything in the Bible is trying to tell you what's right, and this is right, this is right, this is right, this is right. It's a history, and people weren't always right. And people were dead wrong sometimes, and they did it anyways, and people still do today, and they think they're right. It's called self-righteous. So what makes you believe that Luke wasn't trying to tell you that James was trying to pressure these Gentiles under the law? Why do you assume that this is some doctrine, some counsel that you're under today, when it was 2,000 bloody years ago?